So some polling. This is not a political news show, but we like polls. We like data. New article in Politico. Poll: capitalism is out and socialism is in. Here's why I want to talk about this, because I think personally, this is just my opinion, that a lot of what's happening right now and a lot of what's happening in general, I agree with Tyler Schmidt. Lick the stream, please. A lot of what's happening in general right now, I think, is indicative of the failure of liberalism as a coherent political and social framework. I think on both sides of dominant American political life, and of course, both, for the most part, let's paint with some broad brushstrokes here. Most Democrats in America, most Republicans in America are aligned in some type of general allegiance to the neoliberal economic, political, and even cultural project. You have some people on the right who have veered more into a authoritarianism that I think verges outside the bounds of neoliberalism. You have some folks on the liberal side who I think lean a little more towards socialism and critiques neoliberalism, which is great. But I think that right now what we're really seeing, and one place we're seeing this for sure, is in the inability of the American mainstream left, or like liberal left ecosystem, to respond to anything happening on the right. We're going to talk about this more later in the show, but we've seen this week with some of the reactions to the killing of Charlie Kirk, where liberal leaders and darlings quickly fell in line rather than, upset boys on the internet. That's why I wanted to look at this, because we need to find some things to be hopeful about. So this is in Politico. I think this is from today. It's not from today. It's from 2 days ago. And by the time you watch this, who knows when it'll be. But capitalism's out and socialism is in. Whoa. The socialist brand is on the rise, according to recent polling, fueling the left flank of the Democratic Party to argue its ideology is becoming more mainstream. Shortly after Gallup released data showing Democrats and independents are cooling towards capitalism, a progressive organization is out with a polling finding that more than half of likely Democratic voters prefer socialist-aligned figures like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Zohran Mamdani to establishment politicians like Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and Nancy Pelosi. I think, to my brain at least, you can let me know if your brain is different here, this is relatively simple, because there's been enough time now where I think people have seen that the project of folks like Schumer, Jeffries, and Pelosi hasn't worked. It hasn't gone well. Things are not going great. Not only are things not going great in a baseline sense, they've been unable to articulate a clear vision of political and cultural opposition to what's been going on the authoritarian right. I think that folks like Sanders, Cortez, and Mamdani have recently been much more able and much more effective at articulating a counter vision for what society can look like. And I think a lot of the, more mainstream liberal discussion and the mainstream liberal imagination of what that counter narrative looks like, we can see this in the Harris campaign, are things like, we're going to build the most deadly military killing machine in the world. And also, we want you to use whatever pronouns you want. To be clear, it is good to create a world that is safe and egalitarian for people regardless of gender, sexual identification. That's all good. But what they've basically been doing is saying, we're going to maintain an almost Reagan era economic war machine, but we are going to then have the cultural politics of the show Modern Family or something. And that's our vision for the future. In opposition to that, you have more socialist-leaning politicians in America articulating a vision where we're not like a massive war machine that's forever going to war, where we can just admit it's insane and dumb that we have so many billionaires and those billionaires have so much power, where we can critique the dominance of Silicon Valley in our political and military system, where we can acknowledge that housing should be a human right, that healthcare should be a human right, that education should be a human right. And for me, at least, and it seems, at least according to the results of this poll and some other things I've read recently, that is a more compelling narrative in general for what people want their future to be like. I think people are getting burned out on the kind of culture war side of things. This is a thing that happened this weekend during some NFL football games is they showed tributes to Charlie Kirk during football games. And at one of those games, New Orleans Saints game, a home game, people booed. And of course, it's easy to say like, oh, well, all the radical leftist, like all the radical leftist Saints fans. If there's any Saints fans, shout it out. But it feels much more like what happened in that game wasn't people being radical leftists, was people being like, can't we just like not have everything be culture war? Can't I just go out on a Sunday in New Orleans and get day blasted and watch my football team inside of a dome? Can I just do that without everything having to be a part of this weird culture war structure? Why does every show have to like somehow play in to my political identity? Why does every single thing in every part of life have to be like that? So this article goes on to say that Democratic voters also viewed elected officials who describe themselves as democratic socialists about as positively as those who identify as Democrats, and they prefer democratic socialism to capitalism when written definitions of each are read aloud to them. That's a very funny polling. Like, I'm going to read you two definitions. But I will say, as someone that used to teach at colleges, at multiple colleges, if you ever watch one of these and you're one of my ex-students, shout out to you. I had great students. I miss that part of things. But, I would often find that you would have students, especially at some of the, let's say, like nicer colleges I taught at, that came from probably conservative families and things of that nature, who would have a proclivity towards neoliberalism or conservative politics simply because that's what they grew up in. I'll never forget the first semester I taught at a school that I taught at. I won't say too much because I don't want to accidentally dox a really nice person. But I had a student who I liked, and I remember she like opened her laptop and there was a Mitt Romney sticker on there. And I was like, oh, but I was like, you're 18 years old, whatever. And then 2 years later, I had this student in another class. We were reading, communist French philosopher Alain Badiou, and she did some amazing work. It was basically like critiquing the ideological structures of capitalism. And I bring that example up to say that I would find that when I taught, when you detached actual understandings of political, philosophical, ideas from the branding, people would often fuck with them. I even think about like, and I wish I could remember exactly what I did, but there was an exercise I did once where I'd put a thing from Jesus and a thing from Marx on a slide and be like, who said what? And, often students who might self-identify as conservatives or liberals or moderates, when you see the language of Marx next to the language of Christ, they would be like, oh, this sounds kind of legit. So I think something good is happening when we are able to articulate what a political alternative is to what's happening right now in a way that appeals to people. I think that at times there can be a temptation to say, oh, we need our Joe Rogan of the left, and like they have all the money and we don't have the money, and it's like also just like articulate a vision of things that makes sense to people. What the mainstream of the party wants is both democratic socialism as a value system and democratic socialist politicians, says Gabe Tobias, executive director of the Democratic Socialist of America Fund, a political nonprofit organization. I've heard of DSA. I'm aware of them. I know the cut of their jib. Though Democratic voters are warming to socialism, the ideology is toxic to most Republicans and many independents. Even within the Democratic Party, some voters are skeptical about the electability of Democratic socialists in swing areas, a reality Sanders faced during his two unsuccessful presidential runs. Democrats find themselves in turmoil after the national drubbing. Let's bring back the word drubbing they took last year, and have been tussling for months over how to rebuild their party. Try to use the word drubbing in a sentence in social conversation this week and let me know how it goes. You could send those to me and I can look at, the examples on the show next week. Progressives and moderates have sought to shape the debate through polling, memos, and in-person gatherings as they bicker over the path out of the wilderness. Again, not to be too Homery here, not Homer Simpson, like Homery, but someone said, am I tweaking or did I just see my coworker in here? In the chat or on the screen? Am I your coworker? Do we work together? I don't know. And now I just totally forgot what I was going to say. If you do a drinking game where you drink every time ADHD happens aggressively, then you can do that right now. I got distracted by drubbing, then I got distracted by the thing that I said in the comments. I'll just keep reading this article. We'll see if it comes back. 53% of Democratic voters said they preferred politicians described as similar to Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, Mamdani, while 33% favored those to Schumer, Jeffries, Pelosi. 14% didn't choose. The results help explain why socialists and progressives have found success in blue seats in cities, but have struggled to appeal to swing states and voters, to swing voters in battleground areas. And it says in the poll, Democratic socialists were defined as believing that the government should take a more active role to improve American lives. They generally support higher taxes on corporations and high-income earners, support regulation that protects workers and consumers, and want more public ownership of key industries like housing and healthcare and utilities. I think that's a good description. And often when you read descriptions of what socialism, communism, democratic socialism are, the people that talk most about this stuff are weird people on the right. The people that are obsessed with talking about Marxism and neo-Marxism and postmodern Marxism are these weird right-wing people who don't know what they're talking about, and they know they don't know what they're talking about, right? But they know that you don't know that they don't know what they're talking about. You feel me? And because of that, they just say stuff. And what another thing they know is that people on the left liberal end of the American mainstream political discourse and the political discourse and politicians themselves are so afraid of them or afraid of attack from the right, or especially the right-wing media infrastructure, that they just ignore talking about these things altogether. So when right-wing people say crazy things about what democratic socialists mean, it's not like Rachel Maddow or whoever is going to say, oh, actually, this is what that means. You know, it's not like Rachel Maddow has a PhD in political science from Oxford University and should know better. Oh, she does? Breaking news? Okay. But no one's giving that counter narrative. And I'm sure many of you have found this. I found this in my own life, that often if I talk to people, whether at a tavern, a pub, an ale house, things of that nature, or a family member at a wedding or something, when you describe things like this, the government taking a more active role to improve Americans' lives, higher taxes on corporations and high-income earners, regulations that protect workers and consumers, public ownership, people are pretty into this sort of stuff, we've got to lean into that. The survey described capitalists as believing that the private sector is best equipped to make improvements in Americans' lives. They generally support lower taxes, oppose government regulations of business, and want the private sector to own key industries like housing, healthcare, and utilities. You know what the problem for capitalism is? These days, this is just one way I could put it. We were really loving capitalism when we had the coolest consumer goods, when we had all the nicest stuff and we felt like we had access to the nicest stuff and we could afford to do all the stuff. We were loving capitalism. What's happening now is American consumers don't have the nicest stuff anymore. We don't have access to some of the nicest stuff. We can't afford other things that we grew up thinking of as almost our birthright if we pass the right test to enter the middle class. Things like going to concerts and movies and going out to dinner and, buying new technological devices and cool shoes and shit. All of it's getting way more expensive and untenable for normal people. So I think we are kind of realizing that the consumerist fantasy offered to us isn't what we thought it was. Shout out the concept of enshittification, but things don't work good no more. And we don't have the good things no more. I just want to say special shout out to Vorpal Snicker Snack. Thank you so much. I'm glad I didn't quit making videos as well. I realized I really liked doing it. I didn't know that I liked doing it until I lost my job doing it and started doing it on my own. It's one of those things where like you're with someone and you don't appreciate them and then they leave you for their tennis instructor and then you realize you love them. But yeah, Tonks, shout out. That's the person who makes this coffee, friends. Again, yes, please coffee. You know it. You love it. Burns Beans. It truly is the best. Truly is the best. I'm not going to shit on anyone else, guys, but you know it and I know it. I canceled another coffee subscription that I've been with for years because I love these guys so much. But they make electric vehicles in China that are better than what we have and more affordable. Public transportation across the world is better than what we have. The internet is faster in most places. Like, we're not the best country anymore. Now, I'm not trying to do something where I say that like everything we want should be exactly like China or something like that. But I think people are realizing that. And when you do, you start to look around and be like, wait a second. I mean, to use the relationship analogy again, it'd be like if you were in one relationship, like you started dating your high school sweetheart or something, and you never dated anyone else, and you go to college, you get a little bit older, and you start observing the relationships that other people have, and you're like, whoa, that relationship seems a lot more loving and kind and blah, blah. Why don't I have that? And you're like, oh, because there's other ways to do it. And one of the whole deals of American political ideology is telling us, shout to Montel Jordan, this is how we do it. Not another way, just this. This is how we do it. And of course, Luke Phillips notes in the chat that people don't have to get shot in school. That's a pretty big thing. That's a pretty big deal that we don't have to do that. That's pretty great. That's pretty great to not have to do that all the time. It's all about treats. And I think people are starting to realize that the guys who told us, listen to us and we'll give you treats, they're not giving us treats anymore. And another difference, and I think I want to say my buddy Dave Meason, who helps work on this channel, made this point the other day. There used to be an old type. God, it was either Dave Meason or my friend Matthew Telly. I hate that I got them confused, but they're both incredible people. Matthew Telly is one of the musicians who made the intro music for this show, by the way. So shout out to him. But someone made the point that old school rich guys understood that they had to give us enough treats. You know, like classic neoliberals, 80s, 90s rich guys, they got it. That for them to maintain power, they had to give us enough treats so that we would give some type of passive permission to them. The problem with new rich guys is they don't give a fuck. They want computer to do everything. So new rich guys don't give us treats anymore. You know, the new rich guys don't want us to have our little things. They don't give us like enough to just kind of passively sit with it. So we're starting to react against the new rich guys. To use an example here, I don't like anyone I'm about to say, but think about the difference in public perception of a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates versus an Alex Karp or an Elon Musk or a Peter Thiel. You know, in general, when I was growing up, we looked at people like Steve Jobs. They made 2 movies about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Oh, they're like rich guys, but they're like good rich guys, you know? I'm not saying they are. But they created a perception and gave us enough treats to where we were like, oh yeah, we'll make movies about, we like these guys. They're interesting. We look up to them. We let them have opinions on everything. Now you have, again, the Peter Thiels, the Alex Karps, the Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musks, who look like goddamn psychopaths and don't want us to have any sort of treats. After any descriptions, 47% of likely Democratic voters said democratic socialism comes closest to their viewpoint. Yeah, because it makes, people love to talk about common sense, but it makes common sense. Again, this comes from Politico. This article by Holly Otterbein. That's a cool name, Holly Otter. I would call her Holly Otti if I was friends with that person. And there's a cool picture, of AOC. Looks like a kind of J. Crew type outfit with her uncle. His name is Bernard Sanders. But again, I think this is potentially hopeful for us because it does show that if we simply articulate a vision for the future that both offers people a better life and a more sustainable future, and also provides a clear counter critique and counter narrative towards contemporary right authoritarianism, we have a shot here.